at this point, we're always shocked but not surprised, right? Because we're never actually sure what he's actually going to say. And even I was surprised by this one. I was actually thrown aback yesterday when I heard these comments. And he really did sort of make this sort of argument suggesting that, Hamas was the first line of defense against an impending or an eventual Israeli invasion of the Turkish heartland. And it really is intended for domestic consumption, basically to rally around his political base, because he was so discredited recently at the local elections for seeming to be anti-Israel in Turkey and supporting Hamas. But, in actual fact, he's been continuing to essentially, carry out trade with Israel, whilst his critics were saying, well, how can you have both? You can't trade with Israel on the one hand if you accuse it being, quote unquote, a genocidal state.
Where does public opinion stand inside Turkey? I know it's difficult to gauge, but when it comes to Erdogan's, really die-hard support for Hamas and Islamism, where does your average Turk stand on that issue?
I think it's fair to say, look, Turkey is a Muslim majority country. Over 99% of its population are Muslim, and historically they have, sympathies for Palestinians in general. But with Hamas, I would say this is a new frontier because it's elite-driven by Erdogan and the Erdogan media machine. It is essentially, nonstop. It's night and day. They've organized pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas rallies in Istanbul, even one on New Year's Day. Material support, sanctuary, provision of passports to people like Ismail Haniyeh and Salih al-Aruri before he's assassinated. Discussions of possibly relocating the headquarters of Hamas from Qatar to Turkey. All of this gets essentially publicized, right? So the average Turk is essentially very sort of, I would say, pro-Hamas at this point. But you have, people say, well, we shouldn't be surprised because Turkey is a Muslim majority country. There are a lot of regional countries in the area which also espouse sort of pro-Hamas views. And I said, yes, that's true. We shouldn't be necessarily surprised at that. But I would also reply, how many of those countries are members of NATO? How many of those countries are aspiring members of the European Union, right? Or members of every single Western security institution since, the beginning of the Cold War, which Turkey clearly is. So it's a clear outlier, and nobody's essentially questioning it here in Washington or Europe.
Yeah, of course. And prior to Erdogan coming to power, there was some serious talk about Turkey joining the European Union. That seems to have been put to bed forever. Is there any pushback at all from the United States? As you rightly point out, NATO is a NATO member. It is an ally of the United States.
Very little. Unfortunately, what we see is this sort of pathological fear on behalf of, the State Department as well as other U.S. authorities, right? Pathological fear of losing Turkey, quote unquote, in a similar vein to how they lost Iran back in 1979. The fear is that if they push Turkey hard and hold it to account for supporting terrorist entities like Hamas, but also, being quite wayward in its approach to, helping Ukraine against Russian invasion, right? There's very little sort of appetite for holding Turkey to account because they fear that if they do hold it to account with sanctions or really admonishing the Turkish president, right, then they fear that relations and ties will completely snap and Turkey under Erdogan will go completely the way of like Russia and China and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, cut ties with its Western sort of anchor. I think it's misguided. But obviously, the only thing that I've seen, to sort of, hold Turkey to account is it looks like the Biden administration really just recently canceled a visit to the White House by Erdogan after, Erdogan cut ties with Israel trade-wise and hosted Ismail Haniyeh in Istanbul. Those are sort of, I would say, sort of piecemeal measures. Congress has a tougher line on Turkey, I think, somewhat, or used to. In terms of, denying weapon sales to Turkey. But even that has been surpassed with a $23 billion deal to sell fighter jets to Turkey. And the only other sort of institution which is really holding, if it's doing as much as it can, is the U.S. Treasury Department, which has, increased its number of sanctions against persons affiliated with or, advocating for, conducting Hamas business inside of Turkey.
And just a word on what's happening inside Turkey. The Kurdish leader, a popular politician, Selahattin Demirtas, he's just been jailed for 20 years. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I mean, he's been in jail since actually, what's slightly misleading about, Demirtas' position is he's actually been in jail since 2016. I mean, he really hasn't been able to get out. And he's significant because as one of the co-leaders of the Kurdish democratic movement inside of Turkey, he was quite a popular figure. And one of the main reasons he was, jailed was essentially, in the 2016, 2017 sort of campaigns in Turkey for the political campaign. He basically said, we are not going to make you President Erdogan, right? We're not going to help you. And he was very defiant towards Erdogan, and his popularity amongst Kurdish voters, as well as liberal voters in Turkey, right, who gravitated towards him. Erdogan feared that he was going to take votes away from him, so he's jailed him. The reason why they're upholding that sentence with another 20-year sentence is really sort of ratchet up this sort of increasing authoritarianism, I would argue, at home, right? That they're really clamping down and wanting to ensure that any form of political dissidence inside of Turkey following a heavy defeat at the local polls, they want to try and keep tabs on any sort of area where sort of an anti-Erdogan vote or a charismatic leader may essentially sort of rise up against and challenge him down the road.
Dr. Ciddi at the FTD, thank you very much.